ladies and gentlemen, here we are back again on the My Family Thinks I'm Crazy podcast, and I am thrilled to have today's guest on the show back again after a long hiatus for this show. We're happy to have her with us, Michelle Gibson, back on the My Family Thinks I'm Crazy podcast. Michelle, welcome back. Folks have been keeping up with you on piercingtheveilofillusion.com, and many of my listeners have recommended that we have you back on the show. So I'm excited to have you here. How are you today?
I'm doing great, Mom. I'm sorry. I'm doing great, Mark. And at least your family thinks you're crazy. My family has no idea what I think. So this is not something that I can share with my immediate family, extended family. I can share it with my cyber family. But it's such paradigm shaking information that it's just too much if you're not open to it or ready for it.
Right. Yeah, I can imagine skirting around the interest is more uh you know, easy at times cuz yeah, I've made the mistake of trying to broach these topics with unfamiliars, and they just look at me like I'm crazy, and those are people in my family. They're just unfamiliar with the topic, not me. They know I'm, into all this weird stuff, but nope, nope, not interested. But the audience is, and I hope that this audience is part of your cyber family. I feel like you're a part of ours, and I think that's part of the purpose of this show is to help sort of connect all these what were once disparate, unattached theories, all these brilliant minds out there in this sea contributing to this massive research separately. Now we can kind of take the separate points and start to thread them together. And I think that's a big part of the work you do in recognizing these patterns and exposing the history that's been lost.
Right. And that's a good point, Mark, because that's how you find it is in the pattern recognition. It's not in what's written down.
Yeah.
And sadly, they got into everything.
Mm.
And, even things that we're taught to not question
Mm.
and accept as gospel truth. And it's just if it could be written down, that's where they rewrote history. And I'm finding that the truth my main path has been following cities and places and alignments after finding a sacred geometric pattern in North America. And I'm going to go ahead and share the screen real quick if I can.
Yeah, please do.
Mark. So if you've been, for those who've been following my work for a while, you would know this. New folks. This is where I got my start. After a lifelong interest in hidden history, if you will, long before I consciously became aware of any of the work that I'm doing now. I think I was unconsciously preparing myself with what was available at the time. And I just turned 60 this past summer. So that means Chariots of the Gods and In Search of, and it means Arthur C. Clarke's Mysterious World and Robert Stack's program about mysteries,
Mm-hmm.
unsolved mysteries,
Right.
where these topics would come up, and I really couldn't get enough of it. But it wasn't until the internet came along that more streams of information opened up about this information that was prior to that very tightly controlled.
Right.
And the internet basically saved our butts.
Yeah.
Because they had a very, very strict system of information control that we're still struggling to get away from with
Yeah.
mainstream media and so forth. But they're no longer able to control the narrative like they were. And this is something I never did before 2018 whatsoever. I had been studying and doing my own research and, basically getting the information I needed to start putting it together. But as far as blogging and making videos, I was compelled by feeling a strong need to get this back out. So at the very least, people could start making different choices about what we've been told.
Yeah, no,
So
and
you can either accept, what has always been said about our history or places or buildings in our communities or rivers or canals or, railroads. You can accept all of that we've been told, or you can look at the patterns of the same thing all over the earth.
right, right. Right, and when you see this sort of sacred geometry in such a grand scale, it really makes you wonder uh, how they went about conforming to this pattern. You know, it must have fell along this sort of plan. And I mean, when it comes to this specific work, how do you begin to read between the lines? Because you just mentioned earlier how, what's written is often pointing us in the opposite direction of the truth.
So that's another good point because first of all, I learned about sacred geometry around 2007, 2008, which was when I really, really, really started to wake up. Prior to that, I was interested. I had an awareness. I kind of had a questioning mind and had filed things in the back of my mind. But sacred geometry was part of what gave me the key to put it together. And I look at this image on the screen as being a key, as being like the terminus of the Earth's grid system.
Right.
And by the time I found this, I'm going to stop sharing for a moment. Um, I had learned enough about the ancient civilization from other researchers because by then these kinds of programs and presentations were starting to come online. And I found that star tetrahedron in North America in 2016. So uh, let's say sometime between 2007 and 2016, I was just getting as much information as I possibly could. And one of those sources of information was Hugh Newman's Megalithomania Conference. And Hugh is a dowser based out of England. And he and several others organized these conferences where they had presenters come in. And a lot of this information's come back from dowsers following ley lines. Drunvalo Melchizedek was another teacher for me. And how I learned about sacred geometry was through a Flower of Life workshop and some other of his materials. Ancient Secret of the Flower of Life, volumes 1 and 2. I read, that was probably back around 2010, 2011.
Right.
And so I'm just gathering all this information. And, I stood on the shoulders of people that had gone before me in this. Graham Hancock is another one, in Fingerprints of the Gods, and talking about this worldwide civilization, but, more like a disparate element. We see it here, we see it here, we see it here. Mystery, who did it? And Robert Boval, and he wrote a book with another man talking about the Orion mystery with the Giza pyramids lining up with the belt stars of Orion. And both Hancock and Boval were bringing back this knowledge about the earth being a mirror of heaven. And that's key. Understanding this original civilization that's just been wiped from our memory, that built everything in different empires, but they weren't at war with each other. They all worked in harmony. And it was all, we've taught that they were separate. We've been taught that Egypt was separate from Israel and on down the line in Islam. And it was all part of the same system.
Right.
So you see Egyptian things worldwide. You see obelisks and sphinxes and, this monumental architecture, pyramids. And then you've got Israelites being all over the world. But the narrative we're given doesn't explain this at all. And so when it comes from reading between the lines, when I start to do my research, and I've got data points that I've written down on spreadsheets of cities and places in alignment all over the earth. And some are linear and some are circular, and they're all long distance. And then tracking these, and some of the earliest research I did was just tracking these places in alignment. And when I did that, I started to see the bigger picture unfold. So the Earth's grid system was critical to understanding the original civilization. Everything was built along the lines of this sacred geometric grid. the controllers that I believe caused a cataclysm through the Earth's grid system, and that's what the sinking of Atlantis was, um, came in along the grid lines, seized control of everything, and star forts and lighthouses. And in the new narrative, lighthouses became navigational aids for ships, and star forts became defensive fortifications. And I think originally both were part of this energy system. And a lot of times you hear star forts called batteries, and I think that's what they were. I think they were batteries. I think lighthouses distributed light along this system, and they are lined up not only with each other but also with the sun and the moon. And you see that with lighthouses, you see that with Capitol buildings, you see that with the Taj Mahal, you see that with mosques. It's lined up with the full moon or the sun. A great example is Angkor Wat in Cambodia, where the sun goes up the spire. I believe it's a solstice alignment in the summer and the winter, and it just sits on top of the spire of the tallest tower at Angkor Wat. And that type of precision is found all over the earth. But that's been removed from our awareness. Instead, it's been replaced with this random narrative.
Yeah.
This guy came along and bought the property and built this city. This is in North America. And, sold the land, and all of a sudden there was a city. It doesn't hold up if you start looking into it. It just doesn't. I mean, it's not just a case in Manhattan, in New York City. It's in other big cities as well, where the street grids line up with the solstice. Manhattan Hinge is a good example of that. Wow. Does not make any sense. But when they controlled the narrative, that's all we had access to.
Right. And a lot of the folks you mentioned as inspirations for your work, for worse or for better, I think, a lot of them operate still within this controlled paradigm we're seeing now within the past 5 or 10 years, people really starting to push this old world conversation to a further extent. And I think really where it departs from the work of possibly Hancock, and maybe not so much now that he's set his sights on North America. Who knows what will come of that in the next 5 or 10 years. But your work certainly paints this much different picture from what we're given, even by the fringe academics, the guys who push even those boundaries. And part of my research has gone into the secret history of New England, and megaliths are a big part of this secret history. And as far as New England goes, it seems like it was a pretty rugged place that didn't have many stone structures outside of some of these megaliths, calendar chambers, and things like that. The Newport Tower is a anomaly for sure. But aside from what I just mentioned, did you find any examples of old world construction in on the East Coast, maybe in cities like Boston, New York City, or even southward into Philly and Washington, D.C.?
Everywhere.
Wow.
I mean, since you mentioned Philadelphia, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and I don't have anything pulled up on that specifically, but I just want to, so let's look at the Philadelphia waterfront with Art Museum. And what they give us is, the story of this was built. Can you see that okay?
Yeah.
On the right hand, on this side. So this is a view of the Philadelphia Art Museum up at the top. And then you've got all of these neoclassical buildings in front of it. It all looks neoclassical. It all looks like something you would find in what we're told is ancient Greece or Rome.
Right.
And the story is they built it since 1776. It's like it doesn't add up. Literally, it does not add up. Um, because how are we building monumental architecture like that?
Yeah, I've been to this exact place and it's stunning. It is stunning stuff. Now, the what is it? What's the river there? The Schuylkill,
The Del-
the Schuylkill
the
River
Schuylkill River. You're right.
is where all the fraternity and sorority buildings are, and they go along up to the art museum there. So in my mind, I pictured that this was all campus, you know, building, and yeah, it's just very interesting to think that Philadelphia is much older than we're told. Now, does the architecture itself reveal maybe older than what we're told? Is there any indications that it
Oh,
of age or things like that?
let's see. Even if you look at the stonework um, here, kind of hard to see. That looks quite old. But beyond that, it's like they're going to call this, let's say, built in the 19th century sometime. But they're reattributing the architecture as a way of explaining its existence. Um, Another example is what you see at uh, Plymouth Rock. And when you go in there, it's like so many other places where they don't want you to look at what's actually there. It's it's in this same kind of neoclassical structure. So you go in and you look at the rock, but it's in this beautiful um, columned place. But you're looking down. I mean, I was there in here you go. There's a good picture of it. I was there in 1978, 79, somewhere in there. I went to see the rock. I don't remember that structure. All I remember is looking down. Um, the Plymouth Pilgrims Monument in Provincetown looks like that. It's said to have been built as a memorial to honor the pilgrims, and it's said to have been based on a 15th or 16th century Italian tower.
Hmm.
But again, they're giving us this architecture that was already pre-existing. We don't know that. It's not in the narrative. Why should they lie to us? And then they come back and they um, reattribute everything. The Wright Monument at Kitty Hawk is kind of the same way, the Wright Brothers Monument. It's just this incredible structure actually on top of an earthwork.
Wow.
um, why two bicycle repair guys get something like that? So that's near Kitty Hawk. The Ames Brothers Monument in Wyoming, and these guys are kind of interesting. So that kind of looks like a pyramid, almost like an obelisk pyramid kind of shape.
Yeah.
Um, and I like to refer to the Ames brothers a lot because of the Ames Shovel Shop, which was supposedly established by their dad in 1803. And the Ames shovels opened up the West. So why do you need all these shovels to open the West up? Digging it out kind of thing.
Hmm.
And then the Ames brothers, Oliver Ames was the president of, I want to say, the Union Pacific Railroad, and Oakes, Ames's brother, was in Congress and was caught up in the credit mobilier scandal as a congressman, where he was selling um, uh, things related to the railroad, and then they got busted for it. And it's really similar to what's going on today in Congress, with people, with leaders taking advantage of their position to get wealthy,
Yeah.
kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah. And
So so
that's,
Ames, Nebraska is named after him. Ames, Iowa is named after Oakes. Both places are named after Oakes Ames, who, was censured in Congress. And then, like, on the 10th anniversary, in 1873, he was exonerated from whatever he did. And, there's just so many really strange stories associated with our history that, they needed, they had a really flimsy story to hang their new history on.
mm,
Um, but all of this is really solid infrastructure and not easy to build. It's easier to put a date above a door or a building than it is to build one.
right.
And that's typically what you see. It's
Right.
either engraved or in plaster. And then you get the whole thing with it being an I instead of a one on a lot of these dates. So I-893 instead of 1983, and that's a whole nother area. Um, I'm not as up on, I've seen that. And a lot of people talk about the adding 1,000 years to history and that kind of thing. So there's a lot of different rabbit holes you can go down.
Mm. Yeah, I guess my and I don't want to call it an issue because I'm open minded to this all being true. I just like to apply my, rational mind where I see fit. And with the case of a lot of buildings on the East Coast, we have quarries where the stone has come from. And I know you can't date stone, but you can date something like a quarry, right? Where you can maybe determine how long ago it was used. I don't know. Maybe I'm completely off base, and stone is just not something we can date. But I wonder if that would help us understand where these buildings came from, if there's some sort of evidence as to where the actual stone came from. I mean, we certainly have mines in America that are, anomalous. I mean, the copper mines in the Great Lakes are absolutely unexplained, that so along those lines of thinking, I'm not opposed to an advanced civilization being here in America, but where I have trouble is, some of these buildings that we have on the East Coast, I wonder if they couldn't be explained by the industrious nature of the first 100 and 200 years of this country. I mean, a lot of money went into this country and a lot of resources were exploited in America. All the Native American tribes and their land was exploited. They were pushed off of reservations. Obviously, that could have been a part of rewriting this old world civilization, but I guess I scratch my head and wonder, like, so is what we're saying here is that the Native Americans lived in, these palatial buildings, or were they buried underneath the ground and the Native Americans had no clue about them? Like, where do they come into the picture?
So let's talk about the Moors. And I believe that the builders of this worldwide civilization are Moorish, and that the word Moor comes from Lemuria. So it goes way back in time to ancient Mu. And you have a people today called the Washington Moors, M-U apostrophe U-R-S, that were the North America was part of their empire, and then you had Moors, and you know, I'm still trying to work that out, but they were the advanced civilization, and a lot of what was built is just it's just gone. And so the whole the whole narrative is that let's use North America as an example, but you could say the same thing for Africa. You could say the same thing for Australia. The original people were, I think, giant stature, and they were the master builders that knew how to build according to sacred geometry and could work with the elements, had building techniques that have been lost. The original masons, with Moorish masons based on Moorish science. Now, this would never have come into my field of awareness except that I had a Moorish friend when I was in Oklahoma City, which was when I really, really started to wake up to this ancient civilization. Only he was part of my journey. I learned about who the Moors were through my friend. At the same time, I was starting to see this whole civilization pop out of the environment around me. Megalithic stones just kind of laying around, which you find everywhere. And it's all been hidden from us. And so the Freemasons usurped the legacy of the Moorish Masons. They weren't the builders. So you have the Moorish Masons that were the operational Masons. You have the Freemasons that are speculative Masons. So I think the Freemasons were the ones that kind of came in and tidied everything up and made everything usable again after what I think was a cataclysmic event through the grid system. And what they could do was reverse engineer and start to use spell casting and other things through the sacred geometry of this grid system. So they knew how to use it against humanity, whereas the previous civilization used it for humanity. So the narrative is supposed to be there wasn't anything here. And that just justified the wholesale coming in and claiming everything. And the way that it was done, incorporation,
Right.
Turning cities and places into corporations, turning human beings into businesses so they could touch us, which they couldn't before. As natural sovereign beings, they can't touch us. Well, they had to create a system where they could, and then trick us into handing over our power and believing that they have the power and we don't.
Right.
And I did a pretty in-depth piece called The Company where I talked about that, and that's a more recent piece. So they came in with their new world, their new system, claimed everything, and the original peoples, they just split out. And I think there was a lot of social engineering, a lot of human engineering. We're much smaller than we were. I think there was human engineering with regards to skin color. So you have white people in Europe, you have black people in Africa, you have yellow people in China, you have red people in America. And I think that was social engineering. And when you look back at old photos of the tribes that were here, they're black. And so, we've just been given a whole new story. And then around 1850, which is when I think the New World Order timeline got kicked off at the Crystal Palace exhibition in London, you had the Rockefellers heavily involved in the American educational system. They removed critical thinking from the curriculum. They, basically made their education mandatory, compulsory. You have to go to school. You have to learn what they teach you. If you don't, you get in trouble. It's like with everything about the system they foisted on us. Income tax, they snuck it in.
Right.
And then if you don't pay it, you're in trouble. Right. But then it's going to pay for everything else but what we think it is. Well, private corporation. So it's this system that has been designed for control and keeping us asleep.
Yeah.
So that we never wake up and question what's going on. Yeah. But now we're living in a time when it's all coming out. And so, again, I'm saying, if you look into, first of all, with the narrative they tell us, let's use the Civil War as an example. A lot of things that they're telling us, on one hand, were built around the time of the Civil War. In the same hand, we're riding horses, and the medicine is still, Stone Age, where somebody has to like chew on a piece of leather to have their legs sawed off. Just to give some examples, what's a narrative. So yeah, we're on one hand, we're building these, colossal masonry buildings, and on the other hand, we're still riding horses, and living in kind of barbaric times when it comes to human relations. Well, like the Civil War is an example. And what I'm saying is that it doesn't match with what we are taught we were capable of. That modern technology did not come in until the 20th century with electricity and cars and all that other stuff. So I'm just saying that the narrative does not match what we're taught we were capable of.
Yeah, I mean, there's no arguing that, especially when you look at all the pre-Columbian voyages to America. There's tons of evidence that that whole idea of Columbus was a manufactured agenda by forces, elite forces in Europe, to have a political, justification for claiming all of this land. They couldn't have other so-called political European verified bodies there beforehand, like the Celts and the Scandinavians, because then that would take credit away from their discovery claim, right? And that was a whole manufacturing this narrative, and it fits really nicely into what you're saying. And another thing to put into the conversation is all of these out of place artifacts that are found. Even to your point about technology, there have been things that have totally thrown the accepted notion of progress of technology out the window. I mean, we're talking about things like the Antikythera machine, or even wilder, these stone transformers that were found from dating back millions of years ago in Russia, clearly showing that ancient man had knowledge of electrical, devices and how to use them. So yeah, I'm not opposed at all to this idea that there would be some sort of rewriting of history and a dumbing down of the population. I wonder though, what sources of information can we trust if most of what we've been given in America in the English lexicon has been filtered through this Rothschild Rockefeller consortium?
Yes, sir. You question the narrative. You don't just accept what you're told. And that's really my message to anybody that is familiar with my work or follows my work. Is what I'm saying is just question, look around your own community. Does the narrative match what you've been told? Does it make sense?
Yeah.
Don't just accept what I'm saying. Just start looking, because the amount of information is just overwhelming.
Right.
When you really start looking into it.
Right.
And before we started the recorded portion of this, you mentioned Peter shampoo.
Yeah.
And I'm going to pull up something I did specifically tracking the Serpent lay. And one of the series that I undertook was researching places that people had told me to look into. And it was from a viewer that I had learned about the Serpent lay, where it originates in the Bermuda Triangle and goes up through. I took it as far as like Itasca in Minnesota, but it would continue on in both directions. And this is how the story has fallen out to me, was by tracking these ley lines. And for anybody that has any questions, the whole flat Earth sphere thing. I mean, I'm now landing on the side of the Earth as a plane. And the original map that I found the star tetrahedron on that I showed was a flat map. It wasn't a flat Earth map, but it was a flat map. And I extended those lines out, and I'm like, oh gosh, I want to see where these go. And I couldn't get there. The only way I could get there was to superimpose that shape on top of a globe. and then follow the lines out that way, and then write down what I found. And whatever they do, there's some kind of consistency because I have gotten so much information in return using that method. And um, it's been confirmed in a lot of different ways. And I do have evidence of that on my website here. But there's I would not be sitting here talking to you today, Mark, if I had not gotten all this information back just by following these places that lined up.
Well,
And it's just I could have spent a lot of money on getting a computer grid program and not been able to figure out how to use it. It's entirely possible. So, it's definitely eyeballing this, but I've gotten tremendous information in return.
yeah.
And for anybody that's interested in Peter's work, he's got a website called Geometry of Place, and this guy is like incredible.
Oh yeah, we've had him on the show 3 times. He's the best. I like Peter's work.
Woo. So I'm good with my ley lines, but this is like a whole new level.
Yeah.
I got some big picture ley lines. These kind of drill down into the nitty gritty.
It's
Um,
neat that this is coming up right now because we actually, my girlfriend and I moved into an apartment because of some things we learned from Peter's shampoo. Indirectly, we learned about a ley line that went through our state, and then we just so happened to find an apartment that's pretty near close to one of the ley lines in Peter's book. Not directly on it, because I've heard that that's bad, but yeah, the work he's done is really incredible, and it connects to my research into the Ivy League schools and Yale University and their whole control grid of dumbing down the population and creating this sort of elite class. They're the majority. I think there's 9 Ivy League schools. 7 of them are on Peter Shampoo's ley line, the Empire Ley, and that ley line goes down to Teotihuacan in Mexico, and when you extend it north, it goes through Stonehenge. So to your point, these connections are really fruitful when you follow through with them. When you trace these lines across the earth, you find more often than not one place lines up with another place, and I think that's done intentionally. I believe you do as well.
it Yeah, it was, but it was for good.
Right.
When the original civilization groomed the electromagnetic energy in this sacred geometric manner that connects with the celestial grids.
Right.
We're not in a random universe. Everything is way more closely connected than we realize. Um, what the controllers did, the cabal, the Illuminati, the 1%, the secret societies, the Jesuits, the Oddfellows, the Elks, the Freemasons, they created this new world. And when they did that, they turned these institutions and these government buildings and these museums and schools into, grade school, junior high, high school, not just colleges. They turned that into a control system. Banks, see this neoclassical architecture with banks also. And so what was for good was turned into something to completely control our lives, which we're sitting on the edge of our seats right now watching, trying to come in, with microchips, and we want to know where you are. We want you in 15-minute cities. We want to control every aspect of your lives. That's what they want. Do I think that's going to happen? No, but I think we came dangerously close to it happening. So this grid system was reverse engineered into a control system.
Right.
And that's all we've ever known without even knowing it. When you go into a stadium for, football, and the crowds, whoo, that's generating energy. Somebody's harvesting it. And I've got some videos, um, work with Chad Williams and Adam Sakalka on my, not on my website, but on my YouTube channel where we talk about that energy harvesting as batteries. You know, we're this tremendous source of energy that we don't even know about.
Well, and it seems like the grid that was intentionally created to harmonize with our energy bodies and rejuvenate us and uplift us and keep us connected in this collective consciousness type of way, yeah, as it's being reverse engineered, it's almost like they needed to put us all in the places before they could really ramp it up. This whole like orphan train idea where they populated all these cities that were, evacuated in the cataclysm, maybe even submerged underground, hence the shovels that you mentioned earlier. But it seems like this is something that was planned out centuries ahead of time. That's something that I came across when I was first looking into Skull and Bones 10 years ago. My Native American friend and mentor told me that before the Spanish sailed across the ocean, they had a book. He said they had a book this thick all about the tribes in South and North America. He said they didn't come here for the first time knowing nothing. He said they had a whole book about what they were going to find here. And that just put this idea in my head that, oh, they don't just do things by accident. They plan things out way ahead of time.
Right. It was planned out, but I don't believe that we've been under this system for that long.
Okay.
But
That's
was it planned out? Yeah, absolutely.
that's a bit relieving knowing that it's
We wouldn't be in this mess that we're in right now if it wasn't.
yeah. Yeah, well, and that's a bit relieving knowing that maybe it's not too late to do something, and I think you have that same sense of optimism. So what's
Yeah.
really important to understand, because when I talk to Peter, a sense that I get from him is he's very much focused on the solutions and how we can use these grids to revitalize the earth when we participate in ceremony in these sort of nexus connection areas where multiple energy centers coalesce.
Right. And I think we're moving towards that. You know, right now we're in the awakening phase. You know, in order to make big changes, enough of the collective needs to be aware, awake, and say no more. And I don't think we're alone in this. I think there's things in play that when we get through this period of time we're in now, and I think we're closer to the end of it than we were, that things are going to change dramatically.
Mm.
But enough, not everybody, but enough people need to be aware of this and coming from a place of love and compassion, because that's our higher consciousness is in our hearts. You know, they managed to get us up in our heads and stuck in our lower chakras. So it's survival, it's sex, you know, it's food, it's all of these things, and we're not moving up into our higher consciousness and our higher abilities.
Yeah.
And that's where we've been controlled. And they've gotten rid of the people that were up there in the cultures. I mean, there's been so much genocide, it's just insane. Still going on.
Yeah,
But
that's a big part of this whole conversation too, with the Moors and the Native Americans having a much more connected culture to the rest of the world. And when the so-called European settlers, the colonists, the controllers came, they simply threw all these people in the same category and said, no, 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 these people were brought with us. They're all from Africa. Clearly, look at their skin, and they're now enslaved. And maybe that was a part of how they broke them from the old society, is by controlling who they bred with. And I mean, it was a form of genocide in itself, slavery.
yeah, and it's still ongoing. And we've actually all been enslaved.
Right.
We've all
Yep.
been enslaved.
Well, and yeah, that's the big
And,
thing that
and
we touch on this show is the slaves of the chains have just become mental rather than physical.
And the birth certificates being traded on the stock exchange for money that's loaned to the government based on our years of work. That's what a debt slave is. It's not our own personal debt. It's that we've been the collateral for the country's debt. Um, it was just a story where the whole social order was flipped upside down. The high became the low, and then they were just subjugated and brutalized beyond comprehension. And then this new population, the orphan trains, and you know the infantorium babies, for those that are familiar with about 40 or 50 years of babies, neonatal babies being displayed at sideshows,
Yeah.
places like Coney Island and World's Fairs and things like that. Why? Um, onto the things that are coming out today, which are difficult to talk about. I don't even want to talk about it, but with child trafficking in human trafficking, kids being shipped by Wayfair and Balenciaga or whatever it's called. Um, it's been going on. Industrial scale child trafficking.
Yeah.
To whom and why? And that's the dirty underbelly of this whole thing. They're not even, they're not human, but they need and want human energy, whatever form.
Well, and this kind of connects back to the Freemasons in a way, and we've had whole other separate conversations about who might be controlling the Freemasons, what deity they may be worshiping in secret, and they're just one of many secret societies. But when it comes to the Serpent Lay, one concept that I tend to agree with is that there was this brotherhood of the serpents, right? And we see this in all these different cultures, this serpent symbolism. Some authors write about how they were a benevolent, sort of knowledge bringing force. Other authors write about how they were extraterrestrials. Some writers say that they were, basically like insidious and had sort of catches that came with the gifts that they give. But does any of that connect at all to this serpent lay? Am I just kind of using word association here, or?
So everything was inverted
Mm-hmm.
and demonized. So in our system, the serpent is evil
Right.
in the garden. But serpent energy is what Kundalini is described as being serpents at the base of the spine. That's when it's activated, crosses through the vertebra of the spine and connects up here. And then there's wings up at the top, our higher selves. And so this conceptualization of creation energy being, two serpents that interweave, um, is part of our legacy and is part of how creation works. And it's just been turned inside out. One of my early books I read, I guess it was around 2013, 2014, was by Gary Biltcliffe. And he's a dowser. He and his partner Carolyn doused the Bolinas line, starting at the Isle of Wight and going up to the bottom of England and going up to Fered Head at the tip of Scotland. It's a straight line, and they doused a male energy line and a female energy line that crisscrossed over 33 nodal points along the length of Britain, the spine of Britain. And the book is called The Spine of Albion. And I had taken a trip to England with a acquaintance of mine in 2010. And this is before I woke up to this. So I didn't find out about Gary's work until several years after this trip. But when I did find out about his work and read his book, I realized I had spent a great deal of that trip on that line. And I feel like I have a connection to the Earth grid just somehow a soul connection or whatever, which is probably opened me up to a lot of things that wouldn't be otherwise. And so it's energy. And so my understanding is that the energy is neutral. The energy itself is energy. So it's with intent that you get the really positive effects or the really negative effects. And so this is a really good example. I started out with the work that I'd done from earlier when somebody had suggested it, and I had already went along the alignment, but when I went back and did it with about 2 or 3 years of experience, I found a lot more stuff. And that's what's happening to me now, is like I'm going back and adding to original work, and it's taken me forever to get through it because I'm seeing things differently now. And that includes giant trees. And so I'm going back and I'm finding that too. Um, so this part of it starts in the Bermuda Triangle, and I tracked it, Peter's work, and there's just a lot of really anomalous things along this way. And bear with me, it's a lot of information. So there's the largest domestic television and movie production studio outside of California on this alignment in Wilmington,
Carolina, you mean?
for example. Yeah, in Wilmington, North Carolina. Outside of Hollywood is the largest.
Oh, okay. Outside of California. I hear what you're saying. Sorry
Yeah,
about that. Yeah, yeah.
it's like, oh wow, that's interesting. And
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
where Brandon Lee died.
Oh, wow.
Um, I'm going to go into it some more in some other places, but kind of around the coast, you kind of see some areas underwater. And I do think there was a lot of sinking of land. We've been given a whole bunch of books about ice ages, natural causes explaining Earth's history, um, principles of geology between 1830 and 1833, presenting the idea that Earth was shaped by the same natural process that are still operating today at similar intensities, and a proponent of uniformitarianism as opposed to catastrophism. So we're getting all of this literature in place to explain how all of these things happened gradually over time,
Right.
include ice ages. And I believe this catastrophism created
Right. Right. Yeah.
at least what I'm, what is there to
Well,
see.
and this
Um,
meshes well with what I've learned, where a lot of these clearly man-made stone structures are explained away by geologists as glacial erratics, and they say, oh no, man didn't create this. A glacier went and put a 30-ton boulder on top of 4 smaller boulders and aligned it with the stars and all that other stuff. So I agree with you on that whole, reading in between the lines with geology. They've done, many things to cloud our understanding of the natural world.
right. And I probably talk about that example in this. I talk about a lot of things, but everywhere else they're called dolmens
Right.
in everywhere. I mean, and they're all over the world.
Right.
Um, so again, I would encourage, if for those that are interested, just please go look through this. I've got way too much information than I can possibly talk about. But as Sarah's documented, I include a lot of
So
detail.
Cape Fear lines up with this Serpent ley line. In Cape Fear, there was a pretty big UFO encounter that occurred in Cape Fear as well, and people have often synced up UFOs and ley lines. They seem to correlate with each other.
I think so, and I think also flight paths do also.
Hmm.
So,
Now
and
is this one of the lighthouses you mentioned before, the Cape Fear light here?
Yeah, there's a whole bunch of stories that are told along with these lighthouses. Uh, so this one was supposed to have been built in 1903 to replace the bulb headlight, but it was demolished because it was believed that the deactivated lighthouse would confuse mariners if it was left standing. This is what the narrative says. So the Fresnel light of this lighthouse was given to the demolition contractor. It ended up in an antique store and was sold off in pieces. Um, the old Baldy Foundation decided it wanted it back, and so in 2009 they acquired what was left of it with plans to restore and display it. So this was the Fresnel lens that was said to have been in the Cape Fear Lighthouse, and it was at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo. Um, and I've done a lot of work on these World's Fairs and expositions, exhibitions, and to me, they were saying we did this before
Right.
they got rid of it.
Retcon. Retro, yeah, basically saying, "Oh, don't worry about this. This has all been explained, and you'll never see it again." Now, you mentioned this before, how the lighthouses were in a sort of um, corresponding relationship with the Starfort batteries, which that name is certainly not by accident. Battery. Well, what was the Fresnel lens? Was this a way of like harnessing the energy from the Starfort and then maybe redistributing it into the atmosphere? How do these lighthouse work in that old world
I think
equation?
something like that. So it would have been at the top, and just incredible workmanship. Um, I just put this into something I'm working on. This is in Turkey, the Turtugrice lighthouse, captured with that kind of effect, which I find very interesting.
Well, and
And then,
it's similar to what we're told the pyramid once did when it was covered in white stones and had its proper gold capstone. It magnified the sun at noon and made it look like there was a beam of light coming down from the sun to the earth, and that was a big reason why the that area was so sacred and spiritual. I mean, this huge white light in the desert. Oh wow, you have the Mayan pyramid doing the same thing for the audio listeners. Wow, and that's in cloudy conditions.
yeah, so
Wow,
there's if you type in beam of light from pyramid, um, you get some different images, but you definitely have images, one in Mexico, and I've seen others as well.
right, right, and they're calling it a
Um,
iPhone glitch, but I doubt that, especially considering that the beam goes through the cloud. That's incredible. Wow.
yeah, they don't want us to know this stuff,
Right, right.
so they're gonna cover it up.
Oh,
And there's so many things that are called hoaxes. So you've got giant skeletons that are called hoaxes. You've got crop circles that are called hoaxes that are just incredibly sophisticated.
yeah.
It's like, and I found crop circles along the Serpent Lay too.
Wow.
Um, so you've got places like the old Baldy Lighthouse, which is a massive stone tower that looks like a lighthouse, and then you've got what's called the Sulphur Springs Water Tower in Tampa, Florida, that also looks like a lighthouse, but it's a water tower. And if you read about it, it says there was an elevator inside of it.
Huh.
Well, wait, but why? Why have an elevator inside a water tower? And the whole story that goes along with it. And I think it's likely for sure with the water tower in Tampa and possibly with these other places, they were like airship docking stations.
Right.
And I've done some research on that. I think other people have as well. Um, so I'm getting into this because I want to talk about the swamps for one thing,
Okay.
swamps and dunes. So you've got the Green Swamp in North Carolina along this alignment. Um, the Venus flytrap is found within it, and it's like the only part of the world where it exists. in this area around Wilmington. And um, you got a lot of round lakes in the landscape called the Bay Lakes. And what's interesting about the Bay Lakes, which are described as elliptical or circular depressions, found along the east coast of the U.S. in a northwest to southeast orientation. But they're in other places, and they tend to fall along the same lines. Um, and these are just things that I found when I was looking around. Um, and then they have explanations, kind of like the glacial erratics. Um, Things like subsurface limestone deposits that gave way to sinkholes, giant schools of fish that excavated the depressions on the ocean floor for spawning when oceans covered the land, meteorites striking the surface of the earth,
There had to be some
natural
huge
circular
fish.
depressions elongated by prevailing winds and water. But they don't know. It's a mystery.
Wow.
It's just got some other places. So I look at Waccamaw Lake that has a history of a rail line going through it. You can see the railroad tracks.
Well, and
There's a
we
lot.
we make lakes nowadays, right, by damming rivers. Could this be evidence of like a very advanced landscape engineering where they were creating a circular body of water for a energetic purpose? Maybe it served a higher function. Is that kind of along the lines that you're going, or is there maybe a even wilder explanation for these lakes?
No, I think it had a hydrological purpose.
Right.
These lakes, and I gave examples of places with circular depressions. So I'm saying I'm kind of speeding up through some of these things. But Bacalar Lake in the Yucatan is one of the deepest cenotes there.
Mm-hmm.
That's believed to be 295 feet or 90 meters deep.
Wow.
And then other cenotes in the Yucatan. And then I found a circular crater up in northern Canada.
There's a really
And
interesting one in Quebec that looks like an eyeball. You can see it from space. It's like a circular lake with a island in the center of it.
yeah, I know the one you're talking about, and off the top of my head, I can't pull it. This one's in northern Quebec, and it's called Pingualit, but it's not the same one you're talking about.
And it's a perfect
The
circle.
one you're talking about is it's like a dam.
Yeah, the one I'm talking about
I,
is not as interesting in the sense that it's not a perfect circle. What you're showing me here is like, I mean, it's almost an exact circle.
yeah, I can't think of the name of it, but if you Google, you know, dam in Quebec, it should show up
Yeah.
the way that you described it.
Yeah, you could. I mean, if you just hover Google Earth over Quebec, you'll see it. It's massive. But yeah, yeah, this is really fascinating. I had never. I've heard of the Carolina Bays and how there's a mystery about how they were formed, but I didn't realize that it was this widespread. As it often is.
So you've got the plain of jars in Laos, which I also think was related to water and hydrology. And I saw this very first time ever on Arthur C. Clarke's Mysterious World. So, that's kind of how far back some of this stuff goes for me. I'm like, wow,
Yeah.
I want answers. When I was like 14.
Right.
um, the Plain of Jars was heavily bombed by the U.S. Air Force operating against the North Vietnamese during the Vietnam War. And it was said to have dropped, the Air Force was said to have dropped more bombs on the Plain of Jars than it dropped during the entirety of World War II.
Really.
Again, why? I mean, who even knew there were, bombing runs in Laos
Well,
during
and
Vietnam?
yeah, and they were definitely in there to get opium. There's the whole Golden Triangle there, and they were secretly in Laos. But oftentimes, and I've seen this come up in many different campaigns in many different time periods, you have military battles taking place where there are also ancient anomalies, mysterious events, and also, these sort of mysterious artifacts. I mean, geez, the fact that they dropped more bombs on this one area than they did in the entirety of World War II says a lot about, if they were trying to cover something up. Yeah, that'd be a pretty clear indication of it.
And our modern wars seem to have been as much about the destruction of this original grid and civilization as anything else,
Right.
and financed by the same Rockefellers and Rothschilds. So, yeah, they were trying to, what they can't use, they don't want to exist. And
Right.
that includes us.
Yeah.
That includes human beings as we know them. Um, so again, looking at old maps are very interesting. Again, you've got the train tracks going through here. And again, the narrative wants us to believe this is here forever. And they built the train tracks through the swamp. And this is just one example. I'm saying the train tracks were built by the original civilization, and the streetcars and the subways, everything that has been reattributed to modern times already existed and was part of the free energy grid system. And again, I'm just going to scoot through this because there's a lot of information in here. This is squashing it down is like, um, again, it's a mystery. Lake Waccamaw, a lake of unknown origin, a geological mystery,
Hmm.
like the lost tribes of Israel
And how does this
and
swamp
other missing things.
how does this swamp play
Go
into
ahead.
this? Because you mentioned swamps earlier, and I don't know that we got a explanation on that. Does that also add a level of intrigue to this? Or is there something about the swamp?
I believe that these swamps were created by this cataclysm,
Right.
and that land sunk, land sheared off, deserts were created, and building in this country was actually going in and resettling it and getting
Right.
everything
This
working,
disaster
you know.
capitalism that we see happen even in the modern times with, recently Maui and, Hurricane Katrina and even in wars, right? They go and blow a bunch of stuff up and then their companies come in and get paid to build it all back up again.
And that's part of it. And part of it was, and we'll get into this along this alignment. Again, it was like just a wealth of information, just tracking this. Um, so I encourage people if they're interested, just check this out on my website or on my YouTube channel. Um, you find this is a DuPont chemical plant on this alignment
Mm-hmm.
the land has been contaminated, and the DuPonts were at the very beginning of this with the Louisiana Purchase, and the chemical company was started in around 1802, which was the same time as Louisiana, Lewis and Clark expedition and the Ames Shovel Shop. I mean, this seemed to be like around the time this really got kicked off.
Yeah.
So I think the Crystal Palace Exposition, which was opened by Queen Victoria in 1851, was like, we're here. I think the time period between around 1800 and 1850 was when they were just going out and getting everything laid out for this new system.
Mm.
And so there's military bases along through here, disasters. They had a really bad crash back in 1994 when two military aircraft collided midair over this airfield on the alignment. A lot of airborne soldiers were killed. 24 were killed on the ground and 100 injured as a result of these two planes colliding.
Wow.
And again, I think things happen on these alignments to just lower our vibration. This is also where a killing occurred. There was a soldier that killed his family. That was Fort Bragg, which is now called Fort Victory. And so you've got those kinds of things happening. You have the research triangle throughout. It's not directly on the alignment, but it's close by. And then you have all of these high-tech companies that are, many of which are into agricultural technology, like Bayer. And Bayer became Monsanto became Bayer.
Right.
It was bought by Bayer and just sucked up, so you don't hear Monsanto anymore. But Bayer is continuing to do this work. So they're on the alignment or close to it, and they're doing they're they're doing things that on these alignments that would have originally been done, again, to benefit life. So they're testing and they're growing these GMO crops on the alignment. And before, there's information about how this things were bigger and grew faster in connection with megaliths that were in alignment.
Yeah, this is something that, again, is another aspect of my research. The big reason why you have all of these stone structures around the dolmens, as you pointed out, but it's not just dolmens. There are standing stones and rock walls. John Burke, in his book, Stone of
Stone of
Knowledge,
Plenty.
Stone of Plenty, Seed of Knowledge. Yes, thank you. He points out how there's this whole electromagnetic effect, this charging effect on the seeds. And when I was speaking with my friend Dr. Narco Longo down in Florida, and his old world investigation led him to find stories of orange trees that were massive compared to what we see now. Other plants that, grew like pumpkins the size of tractors. I mean, things that we just don't hear about today were commonplace back then. And yeah, obviously the big ag chem companies are mechanized death. It's completely a offshoot of the military industrial complex. Has no incentive of life. It's all about death and greed, and it's a sad state of affairs, the way people grow food.
I found the world's largest cashew tree in Brazil following an alignment.
Wow.
Again, these are how I know, even though, the way that I arrived in it may have been kind of, eyeballing it manual. Once I found the star tetrahedron, I'm still getting good information back.
Right.
And that's just another example. I mean, star forts all over the place, hitting the only land on an alignment in the ocean, like Ascension Island in the middle of the Atlantic. It's just, I've gotten confirmation back in a lot of different ways that it's there's something to this. So again, following Peter's alignment, going up through Asheboro, North Carolina, and here's where you're getting into how the resources were harvested, whether it's lumber or coal or iron, different places, different things along the way. So you've got the lumber barons coming into North Carolina. Supposedly they were behind the construction of the first known, the railroad of the Aberdeen and Asheboro Railroad in 1897 to facilitate their logging activities. So they restarted the railroad so they could get their natural resources moved around. Tar Heels was supposedly the name given to people who worked with turpentine on the docks, and they would get tar from all of this on the soles of their shoes from the trees. The whole Civil War seemed to have a lot to do with railroads. And again, we're talking Civil War, and all of this track was supposed to have been laid sometime, between 1800 and 1860. They're laying down all this railroad track, is what they want us to believe. But what kind of technology did we have during that time that explains this? And important Civil War battles in North Carolina had to do with railroad locations. So I've got that on a map here. Again, the architecture, the courthouses everywhere is this old world style architecture. and then this place, Asheboro, becomes a textile production center of hosiery and clothing and other things. And so this whole becomes a mill area. And that story continues all the way up this alignment, furniture. And then you kind of get into possible evidence of giants. And so you've got a large scale replica of what's said to have been a Duncan Fife armchair that was built in 1950 as a gimmick at the Thomasville Furniture Industries. It's called the Big Chair. And it was said to have been built in 1922, but torn down in 1936 because the pine had worn down. And so they made another one. And that the base of the chair sits on Indiana limestone. And you were asking about quarries and things. It's kind of interesting. So we're told that Indiana limestone was the limestone used in the construction of much of the nation's monumental architecture of the late 19th and early 20th century. And again, you have these huge buildings that look like ancient Greece or Rome, according to our narrative. So here on the right, we have the Tennessee War Memorial in Nashville, looking humongous with columns and everything. So you've got the McKim Mead and White architectural firm all over. And as I remember, they were responsible for the Pilgrim, not the tall one, but the Plymouth Rock. This was attributed to this firm. So when I was looking around for information on the Big Chair, I found the Big Bureau. And the reason given for its construction as a counterpunch from a neighboring community to the Big Chair. And it was said to have been a building that was built to serve as a welcome center for the High Point furniture industry. But after 70 years of wear and tear, another designer came in and made a new dresser. Again, these are the stories that are around it. In past research, I found a giant chair in Anacostia in Washington, D.C., sitting on the street corner. Same idea. It was built as a gimmick by one of the furniture companies. But then you hear about these giants in North America, in America, and, just asking the question, could it be the furniture of actual giants? There's a giant frying pan in Long Beach, Washington. And then there was one that was unearthed in Indonesia. So just a lot of questions. Triads, again, the idea that this was a geometric system. And found out about plank roads, which is kind of interesting, makes you wonder. The plank road boom that lasted in the United States from 1844 to the mid-1850s, with more than 10,000 miles or 16,000 kilometers of plank roads built across the country. And then when you look at pictures of it, just look up plank road and look up images, and you'll see tons of images of these plank roads crossing deserts with dunes. And maybe they're railroad tracks. I mean, kind of looking in retrospect, that might be what they were. But it's kind of interesting to think about. So this whole area, this whole part of the country developed into mill country and factory company towns. And, I was talking earlier about how we're all slaves. So this is a really good example. And my personal experience with this whole idea is that my mother's grandparents were from Mecklenburg County, North Carolina, outside of Charlotte. And I have a ton of cousins there that worked in the mills, and they were textile mills. My grandmother's dad and stepmother, or her mother, but it was like his second wife, moved to Florida in around 1920s sometime. My grandmother married an orange grower and actually had a better life than a lot of her cousins. Um, so I'm like that close to the mills. I never experienced it, but it's certainly in my family, and a lot of people I'm sure can say the same thing. So what were these company towns like? There was one main employer that owned practically everything in the town, which included stores, houses, churches, schools, and recreational facilities. So we're heading into Appalachia, which is known for its coal mines and other mines. Um, the people in these towns were pretty much dependent on the one company for everything. They had a job for life, but they weren't paid very much. And the company got it all back because they owned everything. So like in the mills in the mill stores, instead of being paid cash, they'd be paid tokens that they could only use in a particular store. And so this is how this whole, you know, wage slavery thing came in. Um, the example of Appalachia, it's one of the poorest regions in the United States, and it's believed that the cycle of poverty came directly as a result of this company-based system. It's because the railroad, coal, lumber, and banking barons from early on controlled the capitalistic economic system that came into form in this region. But it's not just Appalachia, it's up and down, as I found out as I was doing the research for this. So in return for a 16-hour workday, they got paid, they got boarding, and they got subsistence farming. Um, and what kind of life is that?
Right.
So again, you're working hard.
Well, and it's also an ideal population of people to have in a country where such a great reset could take place, right? You have the majority of people in this wage slave working class that they're, for the most part, only literate enough to accomplish their, daily tasks and not much more than that. It's only been in the past 100 years that, the public education system gave and libraries gave, the average person access to all this information. Again, questionable information, because it's all coming out of this push to restructure this control paradigm. And I mean, when you start to think of American history less of as like a experiment and a series of accidents and more of a as a planned sort of um, agenda with goals, it starts to make more sense. I think people give the people of our past too much of a benefit of the doubt.
And again, they were in a structured educational system that just wanted them to be able to read, write, and do arithmetic. They didn't want them to think.
Right.
Critical thinking was not encouraged. Like I said, it was removed early on. And those students that did ask questions were not rewarded. So, don't say anything.
Right. And the people that did read and write and had some level of freedom were so attached to this system because of the wealthy, right, who were writing a lot of the material. Their incentive was to contribute to that system that they were earning off of, not question it, right? So a lot of the literature from that time period is inherently propaganda in that sense of looking at it.
Right. And that's kind of going back to if it's in writing, just,
Right.
just, just something to be aware of. Um, More big chairs at this university, High Point College. Um, more triangles. Wake Forest University is on the alignment. You've got a big bell tower there. That would be this one at the
Now
Great
that
Chapel
now that I think about it,
up
there's
here.
there's a big chair in Misquamicut, Rhode Island. I remember visiting.
Just asking questions.
Right. Now,
Um,
bells are a part of this sort of old world situation, right? Can we get into
right.
bells? And because one thing that I came across in my research at in New Haven, they have on Yale's campus a Carillion Tower. It's one of the first coronal shaped towers, like a crown shaped tower ever built in America. And it has this huge carillon in it, this bell instrument. I think a carillon technically is like multiple bells, like almost
Yeah,
like a
it's an
piano of
instrument.
bells.
It's like a bell instrument.
Right.
And I found a number of Carillon's bell towers on the alignment. This was the first one in Wake Forest, and then I brought in the example of the ones at the Ames Campanile. So remember, I talked about
Mm-hmm.
Oaks Ames, same Ames, because it's in Ames, Iowa, which was named for him. And this guy was a crook, congressman. So I found one there. I think these bell towers were part of the grid system. It was part of this perfectly tuned musical and scientific instrument, and they played a function. And so my way of thinking is these big tall bell towers were just sending these frequencies out to the universe. So there's just this Earth was just this calming, healing, harmonizing place. And again, when the system crashed, a lot was taken down, and it was just mistuned. So frequency is very powerful, but we're hearing frequencies that are designed to keep our consciousness in a lower state. So anyway, and this is just an example of you've got this is in Iowa. This particular window's in Iowa, and so the organ's right up against it. So those organ sounds would be going out through that window. And when you look at the shapes of certain piano notes and the shapes of cathedral rose windows, you can find matches in there. So it would seem like these windows were given some kind of form and structure to the musical notes from the organ. Um, and that the current musical scale is not tuned into the solfeggio frequencies. And the results of that, of going from like 432 hertz, which is solfeggio, to 440 hertz, which became the accepted um, hertz, that it negatively affected our thinking skills and
Right.
our
The
emotional
standard,
states.
the tuning standard. Yeah. Yeah, and then just visually, you look at the difference between those two Hertz patterns, and the one on the left, 432. It looks like the sun. I mean, it looks organic. It looks like it fits holistically into our universe, whereas the other one just looks like a blob. I mean, it's like it's totally. I mean, it's almost formless.
It looks definitely looks blobbish.
Yeah.
And then talking about giant trees, we get to Pilot Mountain, um, and it's called a quartzite monadnock. And other places that are called a monadnock are Devil's Tower in Wyoming, um, this place in Norway, Hartigan, and Karura in Australia. And what a big tree looks like in today's world, and the whole idea that these are actually places like Devil's Tower are actually a gigantic tree stump. And I've got a picture here of Jugurtha Tableland in Tunisia, which looks like one with the rings on the top. And the Devil's Tower has the rings on the top in this shot. And then this volcano in Yemen, which is actually it's in Yemen. Let me see if I can find the name of it. I thought it was the Har of Arhab because that was the original name that I saw, but it's in a city called Dammam, Dammamhadt. Let me see if I can find it. I think it's in Yemen. So I guess there's a couple of them, and it doesn't want to
Just
help me out
talking
right
to
now.
someone from Yemen today, my buddy at the gas station, and his brothers are all from Yemen.
Yemen's just a beautiful place, and it's just gotten trashed. Ethiopia, I mean, that whole part of the world is hurting really badly, and it's a very special
Well,
place.
and it's a big part of this Moorish connection too, right? Unless correct me if I'm wrong, but that the Islamic Renaissance, as we're given from traditional history, that may have been a way of covering up this Moorish
Yeah,
expansion across the world. I mean, they were clearly able to make it all the way to Indonesia, and they traveled on these ships, so why couldn't have they gone further into the Caribbean? It's the
yeah,
same distance in the other direction.
there's so much missing. Um, Let me go to my last one. I'm looking for this because I just want to have, if anybody wants to go back and check out the volcano that looks like a tree stump. Um, and I'm doing research on a different alignment of one that I found. I did this first 5 years ago, and now I'm going back looking at the same places, and it's taken me forever to get through because I've got a lot to add to it. But one of the things is the giant trees, and that's a huge part of our story that's missing.
Right. Yeah, and I
And I
wonder.
wasn't I wasn't there until March, and now I'm like, oh my gosh. um, it's such a huge part of our story.
Yeah.
I don't know if I'm going to be able to find it in a hurry.
Yeah, no
Anyway,
worries.
there's this tree stump looking volcano in Yemen. Okay, I'm going to give that up because I got a lot more to show you.
Okay.
So, monad. So I said those were called monadnocks. The monad is a word in philosophy that's used to represent the absolute. So, like the supreme being, divinity, and the totality of all things. So, I think there's a very likely possibility that these giant trees were like a direct connection to the creator and to source energy
Right.
and bringing that to earth and
Like
part of the grid system.
these world trees of life that maybe were destroyed to disconnect us from the creator, by these nefarious fallen ones that we hear about.
Makes sense to me.
Yeah.
So, again, I talk a lot about many different things in tracking this alignment. Um, I think I want to fast forward to Gary, Indiana.
Okay.
Um, though this is an image of the Appalachians from space, and this is what a tree trunk system looks like on the Earth.
Right.
So there's definitely some intriguing things out there to think about. Okay. I want to talk about Gary because Gary is a magic city, and it's on the southern shore of Lake Michigan.
And we would be going past the Serpent Mound too, right? Once we're in
I
Gary, that's well, with relation to the line we've been following. We've
right.
gone
I'm
through the
I'm fast forwarding
Carolinas,
a lot.
then
Yeah, this
Ohio.
this Carolina is in Dayton, Ohio,
Oh
which
wow!
was Miami country.
Right,
Talk a lot about that. And the Miamisburg Mound is a lot like Silbury Hill in Great Britain. And like Silbury Hill, there's a lot of crop circle activity around the Miamisburg Mound and the Serpent Mound. So that's all in here. I went through all that stuff because the most known is Serpent Mound. A lot of people are aware of that, and that was on this alignment.
right. Right.
You've got the whole thing with insane asylums. I found one here that's known for paranormal activity
The
and
Randolph
is
County Infirmary. Yeah. Yeah, and Gary, Indiana now is essentially a ghost town itself, right? I mean, majority of the
right.
buildings there are abandoned.
So again, there's a lot of information I'm scrolling through
Right.
that's really interesting, but I'm talking about swamps being created. I'm talking about deserts and dunes being created. So up on the shore of Lake Michigan, you have both the Indiana Dunes National Park and the Indiana Dunes State Park. And that's just to the east of Gary. And you also have another swamp in that area. So you saw the green swamp back in North Carolina. The black swamp is here. And you have iron mining up in here. So we had coal and logging further southeast on this alignment. Now we're getting into iron, but the working conditions are the same. Terrible. And don't you dare strike. You go on strike, you're going to have strike breakers come in from the military or private detectives. It's going to be put down. You can't strike during this time period. Um, so Gary was called a magic city. Um, It's named after Albert Henry Gary, who was one of the founders of U.S. Steel, along with J.P. Morgan, Andrew Carnegie, and Charles Schwab. And so in 1906, the location of what became Gary, which is about 25 miles or so east of Chicago, was a wasteland of drifting sand and patches of scrub oak. No one lived there when there was no agricultural value to the land. Just happened to be that there were 3 or 4 railroads passing through the area, and the Grand Calumet River wound its way around sand dunes to get to Lake Michigan. So in spite of the horrible conditions, they're still building railroads through there, they want us to believe. In June of 1906, the first shovelful of sand was turned for the creation of the new steel town of Gary. And they had laborers housed in tents and shacks, and they were digging trenches as very little work was being done above ground. And then by 2 years later, the city of Gary had taken on shape and form. And so it was called a magic city, having been transformed from sand dunes in record time. So it was established to be a company town for U.S. Steel, and it became the home to the largest steel mill complex in the world. And its operation started in June of 1908, only 2 years after they started digging up this place. So I was talking about strikes. It was the site of one of the steel strikes of 1919 when the American Federation of Labor was trying to organize a labor union in U.S. Steel. And when the riot broke out in Gary in October of 1919, steel breakers were brought in. And then several days later, the Indiana governor declared martial law and brought in 4,000 federal troops to restore order, commanded by Major General Leonard Wood. For anybody that's ever been in the Army, that's one of the locations of basic training, not too far from Chicago, I don't think. And the strike had collapsed by January of 1920. And U.S. Steel successfully opposed unionization efforts at that time, and it would be many years before unionization efforts started again in the steel industry.
This photo you have there, is that multiple different languages like translated underneath? It says go back to work. Does it say that in multiple languages?
Yeah, it does.
Is that because they had a lot of non-English speakers coming in to work like in these places? Were there like a lot of immigrants or
I I would think so. That's a good
wow.
catch.
Well, because and again, going along these lines, like that's the type of population you would want to place in a new area that, well, in a created area that you want to create a new history for. You put a bunch of people who don't speak the language. Obviously, the Native Americans, they started learning French and English and whatnot. But yeah, I wonder if that played into it at all with this whole reset.
I, I, I think it did. I
Yeah.
think it did. Much the
Wow.
same as what's going on now, with immigrants coming in,
Right.
encouraged to come in, allowed to come in. So U.S. Steel is still the largest employer in Gary, and it's still a major steel producer, but the workforce is significantly reduced. There's been a lot of competition from overseas over the years, and Gary's been in decline for years. And so much of the city's abandoned, like you were saying. So, up in record time by 1908, and then by, 100 years later, it's in pretty sad shape. So, the whole system is to uphold the robber barons up at the top, laboring on all of everybody's backs. One more thing I want to share with you is something that came up on my feed like a few minutes before I signed on to the call. And, that's basically, you see a kangaroo hopping across water. And, to me, the takeaway from that is that there's hard surface just right underneath the water. And that's what I'm seeing with a lot of these places that are swamps and marshes and estuaries, that the land just sunk and there's something underneath it. And with these places with dunes, you have, you know, vertical structures in the desert that they, let me get the sound off on that, that they have, uh, dune buggies is what's coming to mind. But anyway, they've had these ATVs, you know, rolling around in the desert on these structures that are holding them up. So there's something underneath the sand of dunes everywhere.
Hmm.
And I don't think that happened over time. I think all of that is the result of one event, that just went all the way through the grid system and created the landscape that we live in. And we're taught this whole story about it.
Right.
And I get back to question the narrative. And
Absolutely.
we have been lied to. And the thing that's really hard to get your head around is how much
Hmm.
we've been lied to.
Hmm. Yeah, and one of the questions I wanted to ask you, and you already answered it thoroughly, is were some examples of some places where you can find evidence for this, and just on that one ley line, you were able to find all these different instances of cases of places that don't quite add up. I mean, all it takes is a little bit of rational sense to go about looking at these things and ask yourself, how did they build it? How could they have done that? And is it really true? And I think more often than not, you find yourself falling on that last question and saying, no, I don't think what they've told us is true. And yeah, Michelle, you've done a lot to share that with us here today. Now, with Gary, Indiana, are there any other indications that this was a sort of a work? Like, were there any groups directly involved that you were able to? Was it like maybe people in the railroad or Freemasons associated with those groups, maybe in the state of Indiana?
Yeah, I mean, no doubt. And the big names that are associated that we've been seeing along the line. And so in Gary, it was the founders of U.S. Steel and, you know, Carnegie and Elwood Gary or whatever his name is, and
Right,
Charles Schwab, the DuPonts. Um, they're all in it.
right,
And they've just raped and pillaged and everything else all along the way. That's all they care about. Well, there's probably more to it than that, but you know, they've just gotten wealthier and wealthier. and humanity's on the bottom of the pyramid going, oh, wow, I got paid. I've got a roof over my head. I can go to the movies or the ball game or go out to a restaurant and, with no idea about how much has been taken of the true legacy of humanity by by these robber barons and thieves, and it still goes on today.
Yeah. Yeah, we're
It's a big story, and I'm doing my best to try to put it together. Um, because the deeper I go down in the rabbit hole, I'm more convinced of what I'm saying. But I'm saying something completely different, and I do have to put together the rationale for why I'm even saying that because it's like, what are
well,
you
and
talking about?
you have a lot of data laid out on your website, and yeah, I don't blame you. It's a lot of work. I think that the audience, a big part of my learning experience with this podcast is that my audience has taught me so much, and I hope that people listening can check out your website and then use that to maybe figure out what's going on directly around them. You and I are just two people, we can only research so much, but when we start, you know empowering people to do their own research, I think that can unlock a whole wave. So, on that note, do you have any advice aside from obviously, pattern recognition, being able to sort of read between the lines? Any other sort of skills or tactics you've gained through this journey of yours?
I would say, yeah, um, in terms of things that I've learned along the way. And like yourself, I've learned a lot from my community of viewers that leave comments. And so my work started tracking those cities and places in alignment that I showed. Um, More information fell out from that. And then I would follow up on places that viewers suggested, and more information fell out from that. And that's how I found Peter's work, like I said. And more information fell out from that, So it's just be open, and you kind of have to be willing to let go of everything you've ever learned to start to get the truth in. And um, just be open to what presents. And the stories that we've been told are very flimsy. They fall apart on close scrutiny.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, it's just a willingness to do that. And instead of saying that, well, I think the Nashville Parthenon was built in the 1870s, like they said, because that's what I was told. And then when you look at the Nashville Parthenon, it's in better shape than the Parthenon in Athens. Things like that. Because I actually had that conversation with somebody once. No, you're kidding. No, it was built in the 1870s. And there used to be a pyramid beside it. There's a Knights of Pythias building not too far from there. Some Confederate general was the architect that designed it. They were going to tear everything down, but they decided to keep it and they reinforced it. Things like that.
Wow.
Just because they told us doesn't mean
Right.
it's true.
Right, absolutely. Yeah, no, the Parthenon is definitely uh, a stunning example of Midwestern classical architecture. And yeah, you have to wonder, Barry Fell in his book, America BC, found tons of evidence for Mesopotamian and Mediterranean cultures existing in the south of the United States. He's found all sorts of, evidence for those cultures being here. And I think what we're doing is we're learning that history really needs to be re-examined, and I think there needs to be a more composite understanding where it wasn't this separate sort of thing where all of this type of person came from here, this type of person came from here, and they, up until 200 years ago, nobody left their countries. I think that's just nonsense. People have been traveling around the entire attainable distance, whether you're flat or globe. I like to, just skirt that argument completely and just talk about the actual land that we're on. And I think people have been exploring it at great length and distance for much longer than we've been told, way beyond the age of discovery. So yeah, when they landed, why wouldn't they build some cool stuff, right? I mean, this is what humans do. Whenever we make it to a new land, we leave our mark, right?
And not everybody is coming to the same conclusions, but I think everybody that's trying to do the work of revealing what's been hidden, however they're guided to do that, because this is how I'm guided.
Mm,
I'm guided by the ley lines and, looking all over the earth and, putting together what I'm seeing. And I'm not guided by the shape of the earth, though I've come to different opinions because of my other research. Um, but my passion is what I'm sharing with you today. I love going and looking at these places, and it's like I said, it's like it's getting bigger and bigger because I've had over 5 years of experience doing this now,
right.
and just seems like with every new thing I learn, it goes even deeper. Um, somebody else is going to come from their passion and different approach, different theory, but everybody doing this work, everybody. And there's this whole army on YouTube, especially, of people that are like myself that are doing this for the very first time. And like I said, I've been doing it since 2018, but I didn't do this before then. And I did it because I felt like I needed to get it back out.
Mm,
And I still feel that way. And I have so much work to do, there's no end in sight.
yeah.
So, every effort that's made by whoever's guided to do this or motivated to do this is contributing to this whole big gigantic puzzle we have
Right.
of information that's just been removed from our awareness.
Yeah. Yeah. And on that note, what are you immediately setting your sights on next? What can we look forward to?
It's going to be interesting. My main focus is doing the research for the blog posts and making the videos, and so that's where most of my energy goes. Um, I'm going to be going on a trip to the Balkans as a crew member in May. That's oldworldtours.com. And so that's going to be about a 3 week trip, almost 3 weeks. And I've got a to-do list that's really long. And people are welcome to send me things if you want me to look at, or if you want to set up a talk. Like you were saying, there's way too much for one person, and so I've started to do more of that. Is people that say, hey, I want to talk to you about this and do a presentation. I've got 2 up recently on my channel that are like that. So um, it's a big job, but everybody has things they can offer. And if somebody's interested in that, they can leave a comment on one of my videos or send me an email.
Well, right on. Well, your website is linked in the description, so folks, please follow up. You can find all the information we discussed today, trekking the Serpent Lay, and I'm going to mention that in the intro so that people can follow along with that post as we go through the conversation. This was definitely a more of a visual episode, but yeah, I'm excited to put this out and to dive further into my own geographical explorations. I think that's a common interest that we both share. And when you start to explore, you really, I think maps hold more secrets than books do in that sense, you know. And yeah, maps have been edited, but I'm not necessarily talking about the maps you see on Google Earth. I'm talking about the map you make when you visit an area, the map you make when you talk to people about a place and you really start to explore. You know, that process is where a lot can be uncovered. So, with that, folks, happy trails exploring this esoteric America, and immerse yourself in the moment wherever you